Good evening. We are on Saturday, the 19th of February 2022. I'm going to be doing the last part of this book, my story, and it's written by Goldie Alexander. I've put all the details now on the videos that I've already uploaded. There's part 1, 2, 3 and 4. They're up there, but the description of the contents is only typed up in part 4. I'm now going to be continuing to finish the book this evening, and it will be part 5, and it's not as long, so it's called Transported, My Story, the Diary of Elizabeth Harvey, Australia 1790. It's been made into a historical novel, but it is actually based on facts, which I shall be reading when I've completed the story reading, and it'll be following on the historical notes and things like that. So I will read the last paragraph from part 4. Half an hour later, my master was examining Emily very thoroughly. He decided that a chill had settled on her chest, and that we must watch over her every minute. Lizzie, he said, I have too many sick patients to care for, and I cannot stay. I have every confidence in you, and I charge you with Emily's complete care. I gulped and nodded. Now we are entirely alone. Winston had to return to the barracks, but he has promised to be back before nightfall. In the meantime, Emily is running a fever. Her little body feels as if it might burn up. I write in this journal, between wiping her face with a wet cloth, sponging her body, and trying to force a little water between her lips. But she cannot hold anything down. She is really very sick. When Winston came home and saw how poorly she was, he ran to fetch his papa. Emily is sleeping, though still very restless. I write in my journal while I wait for the others to return. Thursday, 27th of May, 1790. Emily is still sick. My master and I stayed up most of the night, trying to bring her fever down. This morning I was too tired to manage any housework. Shortly after sunrise, my master returned to the hospital, leaving Emily in my care. Though I sponged her body and dribbled water between her parched lips, she is no better. Winston came home at midday. He offered to look after her while I went to fill the water buckets. The weather is cool and dry. What rain we had came at the wrong time. So much wet in February, and so little now. The crops are not flourishing. Even my little seeds refuse to sprout. As I walked along the track, hardly anyone was about. Then I remembered Winston saying that people have become too weak and dispirited to tackle any serious chores. Still, it is surprising to meet so few folk on what is usually a busy path. Halfway to the river, I came across Mistress Jane Chapman carrying 2 laden buckets. She set them down long enough to inquire about the surgeon and his family's health. She was most concerned when I told her how ill Emily was. She quickly offered to look after her if I was needed elsewhere. She is a good, kind woman, even if she does reek of rum. If ships don't come soon, she said at last, we will all surely die. I said, how do people manage? Why, many are half mad with starvation. I stared at her in dismay. Does this mean they kill themselves? One poor soul has done as much. She ate her entire week's ration as soon as she received it and died shortly of overeating. She laughed as if she found this most amusing. I have noticed that the worse our conditions become, the more people must laugh or give way under strain. A bone stripped of all meat is a Sydney Cove steak. An empty dish is a Port Jackson stew. A vegetable peeling is a Botany Bay pineapple. Mistress Jane said, it seems that this poor woman ate uncooked rice, and it expanded and exploded her belly. My eyes widened in alarm. Surely not everyone is so crazed by hunger? She stopped smiling. I know of other women who sacrifice their own rations so their children will not starve. Others who use every wile and trick to steal their partner's food. Some are said to even eat snails, spiders, grass, leaves, dirt. Though I was in a great hurry to get back to Emily, I could not help cutting in. Surely things are not so bad on Norfolk Island. Perhaps we should all have sailed with Captain Ross. She chuckled. The governor finds Ross most argumentative and disagreeable, but the man's luck is in. On Norfolk Island there are many green turtles and mutton birds to eat, though their taste is fishy and horrid. When you are hungry, taste does not matter, I said dryly, and we went our different ways. But she's left me much to think about. What a sorry state we're in. We've waited so long for the second fleet to arrive. I am beginning to think that they are all lost at sea. Only Governor Phillip's wise rule stops us from descending into mutiny and death. These and other sad thoughts filling my mind, I collected my buckets and set off for home. All the way I told myself that Emily will be much better, that when I walk in she will raise her head and smile. Winston met me at the door, tears rolling down his cheeks. In the short time I had been gone, Emily had fallen into a deep trance. I listened to her chest. Her breath is so forced, it is doubtful that she can survive. Winston has gone to fetch my master. No matter what is happening in the hospital or how much he is needed, he must be here with Emily. Friday, 28th of May, 1790. Emily is still no better. She cannot breathe. Her wheeze grows louder by the hour. Both her papa and her brother sit by her pallet, though an icy blast comes through the open window. We have made the room warm as possible. My master continues with his tea tree mixtures in an attempt to ease her chest. So far, nothing does. Just before sunset, there was an unexpected burst of thunder. I raced outside. Was this the cannon telling us that a sail has been sighted? From here I could see other folk racing towards the shore. I stayed there looking out to sea, but the horizon was empty. I saw nothing, nothing, nothing. Saturday, 29th of May, 1790. Emily drew her last breath in the early hours of this morning. Now her dear face is at last peaceful. She looks as if she is about to open her eyes and talk to us. I try to draw comfort from knowing that she and her dear mamma have been reunited. Though her papa does not weep, his eyes seem to burn holes in their sockets. But nothing will console Winston. He cries and cries and cries. He suffers doubly now that he has lost both his mamma and 2 sisters. I feel so sorry for him and for his papa and for myself too. I wish I knew a way of making us feel better. I spent most of today sitting in Emily's favourite spot, overlooking the harbour. This way I can pretend that she's still with me. Monday, 31st of May, 1790. These last days have passed in a dream. Each time I leave the hut to fetch water and firewood, I expect to come home to find Emily waiting for me. Everywhere I look, everything my eyes alight upon reminds me of her. This house is filled with her presents, her clothes, her hobby horse that we carried all the way from Rose Hill, her doll, her wooden top. I keep on waiting for her to run inside and call to me. We buried her under a stand of red gums not far from here. Winston fashioned a small wooden cross and wrote her name upon it. He says that shortly he will shape a tombstone. Then he will carve on it, Emily Mary Russell, born September 1785, died May 1790. Her body may lie there, but her memory will stay with me forever. Today both the surgeon and Winston return to their duties. I think that for them this is best, but I do not know what to do with myself. Whereas before I was always so busy, always had so much to do. Suddenly, I find myself wandering in aimless circles. Tears roll down my cheeks. I cannot stop crying. I weep for all the people I have lost. The tears never seem to end. I cannot believe that I still have so much crying left in me. Also, and this seems so selfish, while Emily still lies warm in her grave, hunger forms a hollow in my belly. hunger makes me so weary. I could sleep away the nights and half the days. But when I sleep, I dream. And then my dreams are plagued with images of freshly baked bread, creamy milk and butter from Mama's cow, mutton pies covered in gravy, new season peas, beans and apples, wild strawberries and berries plucked from the hedge furrows. I wish that I were not so tired. All I want to do is sleep. Tuesday, 1st of June, 1790. We have no food. My master sent me to gather shellfish. I walked as far as the Lieutenant Dawes Observatory, this being a very long way from our hut. It took me 2 hours to get there. But when I knocked on Lieutenant Dawes' door, no one was about. The last time Emily and I came here, I had noticed how the house was not far from a cliff. Below it was a wide band of rocks. They were the kind of rocks where oysters flourish. Perchance this was not the best time to go looking for shellfish. The wind was high, the tide only half out. I felt weak from too much hunger and despair. The cliff face was covered in a pale green succulents. Hanging on to them to steady myself, I slid down to where the sea hit the rocks. On their inner side, the sides not facing out to sea, I could see rich oyster beds. I think there were enough to keep us in food for several days. What I had not realized was how sharp those rocks were, or how hard it would be to balance myself on the rock's slippery surface, or how wild the sea was. I was reaching forward to loosen a fat oyster when a white-crested wave swept me off my perch. The wave carried my bucket and knife out to sea and tried to make me follow. Just in time I managed to cling to a rock where I waited for the wave to subside. My hands scratched and bleeding, I slid further along the shelf to look for my tools. No sign of the knife. But about 10 yards out, the bucket bobbed along the waves. Tears rolled down my cheeks. Yet another calamity amongst so many. Both knife and bucket would be missed. I had no means of replacing them. My master would be angry. I turned to climb back up to the top of the cliff, but the way up was much harder than coming down. Halfway my foot slipped and sent an avalanche of mud and rocks tumbling into the sea. I glanced down. That was a mistake. My stomach lurched. I swayed and felt dizzy. Waves poured over the rock where I had just stood. I swayed a little more. One more moment and I was about to fall. I closed my eyes and waited for my heart to stop pounding. Only 2 more steps, I told myself, and you will be safe. I grasped a salt bush growing at the very edge of the cliff. To my horror, the branch was too brittle to hold on up my weight, and it snapped in 2. My only luck was that my other hand still clung to a protruding ledge. But I could go no further. Meanwhile, dozens of seagulls wheeled above my head, thinking I had come to raid their nests for eggs. They cawed angrily at me. Only one more move, I told myself, and you will be safe. But I had not an ounce of energy left within me, not even enough to save myself from falling, nor to prevent myself from being dashed against those rocks. Instead, I hung there, poised between heaven and hell, and without that last effort needed to haul myself into safety. Another moment and I would fall. Another moment and I would be dead. And perhaps this would not be so bad. Then I would no longer have to live with hunger and despair as my constant companion. I have heard that in the few moments before people drown, their whole life passes before their eyes. Something like that happened to me. Edward, you may find this hard to believe, but as in a dream, I saw myself as a small child with you running beside me, and coming home to a warm supper and loving parents. I saw Mama and Papa become ill and die. Then myself as an apprentice, racing along the streets of London. I saw the years in Newgate Prison alongside Sarah and our life in the hulks, the long voyage, and these last 2 years in Port Jackson. As if all memory had turned into water, that stream of remembrance flowed over me. But as I clung, semi-conscious, to the cliff face, a woman's voice spoke inside my head. It sounded very much like our own dear Mamma's voice, though now I wonder if perhaps God was speaking through her. The voice said that I had seen too much, that I had come too far to die in such a forlorn place. The voice commanded me to go on living. I took a deep breath and hauled myself up. Then I was flat on my back, staring up at the sky. Circling above me, I was looking up at swooping seagulls and fluffy white clouds, while the sun burnt a hole in my head. I closed my eyes and waited for the reddish flashes in front of my eyes to disappear, for the hammering in my ears to stop, for my breathing to slow down. I must have fallen into a deep slumber. Suddenly, Emily was standing right in front of me. She seemed so vibrant and alive. My heart leapt with pleasure at seeing her thus. She beckoned to me, crying that her Mamma wanted to thank me for looking after her so well. I told her how pleased I was to see her this happy, but then I added, "How can I go with you? You are dead, and I am still alive. Besides," I added as she was about to protest, "my own Mamma tells me that I must stay here." "Then we will wait for the right time to be together," she promised. And with that she kissed me, and I woke up. I lay there musing over my dream. Emily seemed so content, as did our own Mamma. Could these spirits really have spoken to me? Then I decided that even if these were just figments of my imagination, that I should tell Winston some of this. Might this not comfort him a little? Wednesday, 2nd of June, 1790. After I confessed yesterday's mishap, my master was more upset that I might have drowned or fallen to my death than at the loss of the bucket and knife. We have eaten all our rations. I have nothing to prepare for tonight's meal. But my master has promised me that he will bring home some vegetables. He says that one of the convicts has an abscessed leg. My master has promised to lance it for him, though the wound contains a lot of pus, and this suggests it will get better of its own accord. The convict has pledged some potatoes and carrots in return. I have yet to talk to Winston. He stays on duty at the barracks until tomorrow. Perchance I will tell him about yesterday's dream. Was my hearing Mamma's voice and seeing little Emily just visions? Either way, I know that Emily is far happier now than when she was alive. I have more fire in me today. I have managed to sweep and dust the hut and collect more water and firewood. I've even dug over my vegetable patch. My seeds have started to sprout, tiny green shoots. Now I must nourish the bed the way our Papa and Mamma did back home. Perchance I will find some horse droppings near the barracks. In the late afternoon, I walked as far as Governor Phillip's house. There was the usual group waiting to speak with him. They were quarrelling so much I could hear them as I was coming down the track. Truly it is a great man who can manage such an unruly bunch of officers, seamen and convicts. They say that the governor has a very stubborn spirit, that he lacks the necessary grace to become a great gentleman. But I think that it is rare to find a ruler who is so impartial. He has even handed over his private stock of flour to be shared around the colony. My master tells me that he heard Governor Phillip insist that we would not starve. As soon as the first ship from England arrives, he promises our present sufferings will be over. I pray that he is right. When I got home, both Winston and my master were waiting for me. My master said, "Look at what I've brought for you, Scheherazade. Potatoes and carrots for our supper." But first, he pulled out a bench for me to sit on. "We have something to tell you." Heart in my mouth, for I expect all tidings to be bad, I waited to hear him out. He settled on a stool in front of me and said, "Winston and I have been given orders to return to England on the very first ship that sails home." I took ages to take in what he was saying. Then I wept and wept and wept inconsolably. "What will happen to me now?" I cried at last. "I'm not allowed to return before I finish my sentence." My master took my hand in both his large ones. "We have learned to love you as dearly as if you were part of our family. We would trust you with our lives, and we are sure that you have been transported here most unjustly." His face fell into deeper lines. "But not even Captain Phillip has the power to allow you to return before your sentence is complete." I wept more loudly. My master glanced at Winston, who stared sadly back. He said, "Lizzie, do you not have a good friend in Rose Hill? Yes, sir, that I do, I said, weeping, my teary face on my sleeve. I'm sure that Sarah is missing me most sorely. Also, when we were on our way to Sydney Cove, I promised the convict woman Margaret that I would teach her and Sarah their letters. I would very much like to keep my word. Was not Margaret heavy with child? Indeed she was. My master's sigh was heavy. If the baby should happen to be a girl, ask Margaret to call her Emily. My eyes filled once again. Sir, that I will indeed. My master sighed. They will be very pleased to have you back, he decided. So he and Winston waited for me to pull myself together. I did. And then set about preparing potatoes and carrots for our supper. Thursday, 3rd of June, 1790. The wind is cold and fierce. Autumn has vanished and winter is now upon us. My household tasks over, I set off towards the storehouse and my favourite place under some red gums that look out to sea. I took my quill, ink and book. I had intended writing in my journal. Who should I come upon but Winston? I could see that he had been crying, for his cheeks were pale and his eyes swollen and red. I quickly told him about the vision I had of Emily and how happy she had been. I said, perhaps God does indeed look after the innocent. And this seemed to cheer him a little. You have been a true friend, he said to me. Surely there is something I can do for you in return. I would like to repay you for all you have done for Emily, nay, what you have done for all my family. There was a long silence as I considered his offer. Indeed there is, I replied at last. You will surely be returning to England. Only if a ship ever arrives to take us home. One must come sooner or later, I said firmly, for I refuse to believe that we've been left here to slowly rot and die. He pulled a face. I wish I had your hopefulness of spirit. Winston, my favour is this. I took a deep breath and held up this journal. Do you recall my reasons for wanting this from you? He nodded, but his eyes flickered, and I could see that he did not. I said, I would dearly like for you to travel to the west of England, then go to the Cotswolds and find the village of Cranham, and once you are there, to seek out my brother Edward, and then to give this book to him. To my delight and relief, he promised to do just this, saying, I will never forget how much Emily enjoyed the onions you so bravely stole for me. I also admired how much you were prepared to risk so you could write to your brother. You can be sure that this journal will arrive most safely in his hands. He was about to say more when something on the horizon caught his eye. At the very same moment, we both heard the echoing boom of a cannon going off. We jumped to our feet, both shouting with joy. A cannon boom meant that a sail had been sighted. The second fleet had finally arrived. The second fleet was sailing into Sydney Cove. Now we are saved! Edward, I write this a little later. You cannot imagine what rejoicing there is in Sydney Cove. But all I can think is, now this journal will come to you. Now you will know that I am still alive, that I have never forgotten you, and that God willing, one day we will be together. The end of my story, Transported, the Diary of Elizabeth Harvey, Australia 1790. Deborah, I'm now going to read the historical notes, which are quite important, so it will take a few more minutes to read the historical notes, which are important to the story after you've heard it, not before. This imaginary diary is partly based on the real life story of Elizabeth Hayward. She was the youngest female convict to sail on the First Fleet's transport ship, the Lady Penrhyn, on 18th of December 1786. Elizabeth was sent to prison for stealing clothes worth 7 shillings. She was sentenced in January 1787 to 7 years transportation. But this is where this diary turns to fiction. The real Elizabeth Hayward was given 30 lashes for insolence in 1788. She was transported to Norfolk Island in March 1790, where she gave birth to at least 4 children. In 1813, she left the island as the wife of Joseph Lowe. It may be her name on the records of St. John's in Launceston. Elizabeth Lowe, who died in October 1836, aged 66. 2 centuries ago, many people in Britain lived every day with hunger, dirt, disease, and poverty, mainly in cities like London and probably Manchester, Liverpool, and all those big cities. And like in London, and the streets were choked with rubbish, and people lived in crumbling tenement buildings, large blocks of flats. Children from poor families were sent out to work, sometimes when they were just 6 years old, and often in life-threatening jobs such as cleaning chimneys or working in the mines and the cotton factories. If these children were orphans, they could be bought and sold like slaves. Crime was widespread in these areas in particular because conditions were so poor. People had to do what they could to survive. There was no central police force, and punishments were often far too harsh for the crime committed. Though many were sentenced to death on the gallows for housebreaking, stealing food, or maybe even fortune-telling, many were pardoned by the king and sent to prison instead. The privately run prisons, which all there weren't government ones in those days, were dark and smelly. Prisoners even had to buy their own food and bedding from those who run the prisons. Cells were hardly ever cleaned, and like the city itself, had no proper sewerage system. Many prisoners died of starvation, prison fever in brackets, which we now know as typhus or typhoid fever, swept through the cells. Another punishment was transportation to America to work on the cotton plantations. But in 1766, the American colonies declared independence from Britain. Prisoners now had to be kept at home in the unovercrowded prisons. One solution to this was to strip the old ships of their rigging and masts and turn them into hulks, massive prison ships. But the conditions in the hulks were worse than the prisons, so the government had to look elsewhere, and they settled on sending prisoners to Australia. The English had been interested in finding a base in the Pacific Ocean and wanted to occupy Australia before the French got there. Captain James Cook had brought back good reports of this great southern land. Its plentiful timber and flax were perfect for shipbuilding, and so the idea of the first fleet was born. 11 great ships would take 759 convicts, Royal Marine Guards, some officers and their supplies, to Australia, with Captain Arthur Phillip as head of the fleet for the long and complicated journey. The ships arrived in Portsmouth on the 16th of March 1787. My older brother Alan Walmsley, now deceased many years, was born on the 16th of March 1945. Rest in peace, Alan. He died of prostrate because they never did much testing, and I think any men over 40 should be tested. He died at age 59. It's too young. But the departure was held up. Some convicts were on board for 7 months before an outbreak of prison fever hurried things along. The first fleet left England on 13th of May 1787. They stopped at Tenerife and Rio de Janeiro to get food supplies and send the sick ashore. Because Captain Phillip had supplied oranges and other fresh produce, very few convicts died of scurvy during the voyage compared to later convict fleets. The first fleet arrived at Botany Bay between the 18th and 20th of January 1788. This location had been recommended by Captain Cook in 1770 as a possible place to settle, but the area lacked enough fresh water, was not safe for ships, and the soil was far too poor for growing crops. So Captain Phillip sailed north and arrived at Port Jackson on 26th of January 1788. The settlement was to have many problems. Most of the convicts had come from cities and knew nothing about growing their own food or looking after livestock. It was a hot, dry, infertile country, and soon everyone from convicts to captain were placed on rations. Before 1788, about 300,000 Aborigines lived in Australia. For more than 2,000 years, these nomadic people had seen very few Europeans, and until 1788 they were probably happier and healthier than most Europeans. They fished and gathered oysters in the sheltered bays. Their lives were rich in storytelling, music and ceremonies. Although Governor Philip tried to befriend the local Iora tribe, their cultures were just too different. And soon the Aborigines and the settlers learned to distrust each other. Diseases like cholera, smallpox, and influenza swept through the Aboriginal population, killing many and dislocating those that survived. The Aborigines lived on local plants and fish, but the settlers did not find these appetizing. They occasionally ate rats, dogs, possums, and kangaroos, but they had little ammunition to hunt with. Oh, and they proved to be poor fishermen. Most of the settlers' food had to come from the supplies brought with them on the ships. This resulted in their total dependence on the shipping trade, which did not include Australia on its route. Shelter was also a problem, as they didn't have proper tools to build with. They also had very little clothing, and by the time the second fleet arrived, convicts and marines alike were dressed in patched, threadbare clothing. So things really were desperate for the settlers at the beginning, and some attempted to escape, even though punishments would have been severe if they were caught. Locations with far better conditions than Sydney Cove had been found by First Fleet ships. Norfolk Island was more fertile, and creatures such as green turtles and mutton birds were used to supplement the Sydney colony's dwindling food supplies. However, the island was surrounded by rocky cliffs, which meant that timber could not be loaded onto ships for transport back to Sydney Cove. Exploring the country to the west of the cove, the settlers found more fertile land on the Parramatta River, a settlement they named Rose Hill. There they soon produced good crops of maize, wheat, barley, oats and potatoes, but lack of transport again proved to be a problem. For the early settlers, the struggle to keep themselves alive was momentous. They started to build on the rocks, the craggy sandstone on the western side of Sydney Cove. Cottages clung to the stone and some dipped dangerously towards the sea. The coast had been stripped of trees and rock to provide ballast for ships, and this gave it a run-down look. If you had been there at the time, you would have been horrified by the smell of rotting waste by the banks of the tank stream and bits of drying flesh from corpses on Gallows Hill. But although Australia was a wild and lonely place, there were no man-eating animals. The climate was hot in summer and mild in winter, and it was a healthy country for people, animals and plants. During the starvation years, more babies were born and fewer children died than if these early settlers had stayed in England. 45 children arrived with the first fleet. by the middle of 1790, 83 babies had been born, though 25 of the original children had died. This number of deaths was not considered that high for the time. In 1789, Isabella Rossum established the first school. Some of the convicts eventually became wealthy and respected citizens. The opportunity of starting afresh in a new land helped many discard their pasts and prosper. This is a fictional diary, and it takes place during a 2-month period at a time of great struggle and starvation, when after a series of delays and disasters, the colony was desperately waiting for further supplies to arrive on the Second Fleet. Continuing with the timeline now, which you will find fascinating. 1606, the earliest recorded contact between Europeans and Aboriginal native people. A Dutch ship lands on the western coast of Cape York Peninsula. 1642, Dutchman Abel Tasman reaches southwestern Tasmania and claims the territory for Holland, calling it Van Diemen's Land. 1760, King George III becomes King of England, and his reign lasts for 60 years. 1770, Captain James Cook claims possession of the whole of the east coast of Australia, raising the British flag at Possession Island off the northern tip of Cape York Peninsula. 1776, the United States of America declares independence from Britain. Britain must find another place to send its convicts. 1787, the First Fleet leaves England on May 13th and arrives at Sydney Cove between the 18th and 20th of January 1788. 1789, outbreaks of smallpox introduced by the British led to the death and devastation of the Aboriginal native population of Sydney and the surrounding areas. 1790, ships of the Second Fleet arrive at Port Jackson. On the voyage from England, 267 convicts die. 1791, tobacco is first grown in Australia. Citrus trees are planted along the Parramatta River, and whaling first begins off the coast of Australia. The ships of the Third Fleet arrive. 1792, France is declared a republic. 1792, the first free immigrants in Australia settle at Liberty Plains. 1796, around this time, a naval dockyard is established at Sydney Cove. 1798, steam-powered spinning begins in English mills. Workers are replaced by machines. 1799, the beginning of a 6-year period of resistance to white settlement by Aborigine natives in the Hawkesbury and Parramatta areas known as the Black War. 1800, the Irish Parliament passes the Act of Union with England. 1802, Matthew Flinders circumnavigates Australia. 1803, The first settlement in Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania. 1803, Australia's first newspaper, the Sydney Gazette, a New South Wales Advertiser, is founded. First record of a cricket match played in Australia. 1804, the slaughter of Aborigine natives in Van Diemen's Land begins. How sad. Settlers are authorised to shoot the native Aborigine people on sight. How evil is that? That is wickedness. That is absolute total wickedness. That is evil. That's horrible. 1805, the Battle of Trafalgar. The British Navy wins against the French, but they lose. Admiral Lord Nelson. 1807, the first Australian wool is exported to Britain. 1807, praise the Lord, the slave trade is abolished in the British Empire. Altogether, between 1788 and 1868, about 137,000 males and 25,000 female convicts were transported to Australia. And here's the map that is on the book. I'll turn the page. This is a portrait of, that's Tasmania and Australia. This is a portrait of Arthur Phillip, the naval commander and governor of Sydney Cove. He looked like he was a very intelligent man. And here is a painting showing the ships of England's first fleet entering Botany Bay in 1788. So these pictures exist. So this other pictures on this side are the paintings showing prison bulks anchored in the river in the Thames, London, and then the bottom picture is an early illustration of a kangaroo drawn during Captain Cook's expedition to Australia in 1770. Excuse me. See what other pictures we've got here. And here's another photograph. This is Sydney Cove, an illustration of the early days of the colony. Doesn't look much to look at, looks pretty rocky and grim. So they were brave people, weren't they, really? The picture Acknowledgements is a map illustrated by Andras Berezny, and then Arthur Phillip Page, Mary Evans Picture Library, and then an Aboriginal gathering, J. Neagle, Mary Evans Picture Library, and then the First Fleet enters Botany Bay, J.R. Ashton in Australia, illustrated Mary Evans Picture Library, and then the Prison Hulks, Samuel Prout, Mary Evans Picture Library, then Kangaroos from Banks' New System of Geography, Mary Evans Picture Library, and then Sydney Cove, R.F. Jukes, Mary Evans Picture Library. So that is the end. And I see there's other books on the hunger, the diary of Phyllis McCormack, Ireland. There's another book, Voyage on the Great Titanic, Margaret Ann Brady, 1912. And there's one on the Blitz, 1940-41, Eddie Benson, London. And then there's another story of the Crystal Palace, the diary of Lily Hicks, London. Oh, was that not the fire at Crystal Palace? I'm not sure. And then the 12th Century Girl, the diary of Flora Bonington, London, 1899 to 1900. And then there's the story of the Tudor Queen, the diary of Eva de Puebla, London, 1501 to 1513, and then there is the 45 Rising, the Euphemia Grant, Scotland, 1745. I've got Scottish ancestors, so that probably would please me. And this is the Great Plague, that's 3rd of July 1665, Alice Peyton, London. So there are other books in this series of historical ways of telling history as novels. So thank you so much for listening. Bless you all. And Deborah, I hope you've enjoyed that book. I had to get it out of the way because when I start doing the other things, it wouldn't get finished. So it is finished now, and I hope you do enjoy it. Let me know or email me or something. God bless you and good night. Thank you so much for listening. Bye-bye.